The wind howled across the plains like a pack of hungry wolves, clawing at the wooden walls of a small, forgotten cabin. The moon hung low, veiled behind heavy clouds, and the snow came down in sheets, thick, relentless, and biting. The night was the kind that seemed to swallow sound, to freeze time, to make a person feel completely and utterly alone. Inside that cabin, a woman sat by the dying glow of a fire, clutching a small bundle close to her chest. Her name was Clara Mayfield, a young mother who had seen too much hardship for her 23 years. Her baby, barely a year old, whimpered softly under the thin blue blanket she had wrapped around him. Clara's lips trembled, not from fear, but from the cold that crept into her bones no matter how close she sat to the fire. She had run out of wood hours ago. The last few pieces had burned down to orange embers, flickering weakly against the dark. She rocked her child gently, whispering lullabies through chattering teeth. "Hush now, little one. Mama's here. We're going to be all right." But she didn't believe her own words. The truth was, she had been running for 2 days. Running from a man who once promised her love, only to turn cruel when she needed kindness most. She had fled in the night, taking nothing but her baby, a few clothes, and whatever courage she could gather. Every step through the snow had been a prayer that someone, anyone, might cross her path before she and her baby froze. Now, in the middle of nowhere, her prayers seemed to vanish into the wind. The baby whimpered again, this time weaker. Panic surged through Clara's chest. She pressed her lips to his forehead. It was cold, too cold. She pulled the blanket tighter, wrapping her arms around him, trying to share what little warmth her trembling body could offer. Tears welled in her eyes. She hadn't cried in months, not since she'd decided to leave that broken house behind. But as she looked down at her baby's face, pale and small in the flickering light, her heart broke all over again. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Mama's trying. I promise I'm trying." Outside, the storm raged on, miles away. A man on horseback cut through the snow like a shadow against the white. His name was Elias Walker, a rancher known for his silence and his strength. He'd been driving cattle earlier that day when the storm hit, faster than anyone expected. By nightfall, he'd managed to get his herd to shelter. But the trail home had disappeared under the snow. He tugged his scarf higher around his face, his breath turning to mist in the air. The wind bit at his skin, but Elias had weathered worse. The land was harsh, but he understood it, the silence, the solitude, the way the wind could whisper truths if you listened close enough. Then, through that silence, something strange reached his ears. Not the wind, not the creak of frozen trees, but a faint sound. Almost too soft to be real. A cry. He stopped his horse and listened again. There it was. A baby's cry, thin and fragile, carried by the wind. His pulse quickened. Out here, in this cold, there shouldn't be anyone. Not a woman, not a child. Elias turned his horse toward the sound, urging it forward through the snow. He followed the faint light of a dying fire, and within minutes he saw it. A small cabin, half buried by the storm. He dismounted quickly, boots crunching through the drifts. The door hung slightly open, its hinges creaking with every gust. Elias pushed it open and stepped inside. At first, the woman didn't see him. She was rocking her baby near the fire, whispering desperately to keep the child awake. When she heard the door, she turned, eyes wide with fear. "Who's there?" she gasped, pulling her baby close. Elias raised his hand slowly. "Easy, ma'am. Name's Elias Walker. I heard the cry from the trail." His voice was low and calm, carrying the kind of authority that only comes from years of facing storms and silence. Clara's eyes flickered between him and the door, torn between fear and hope. I didn't mean to trespass. I just needed shelter for the night. My baby, he's so cold." Elias looked at the child and saw the danger immediately. The baby's skin was pale, his breath shallow. He knelt beside them without another word and stripped off his heavy coat, the thick woolen one that had kept him alive through many winters. He wrapped it around the woman and her child, tucking it close around their shivering forms. "Here," he said quietly. "You'll both freeze if you stay like that." Clara stared at him, her lips trembling. "You'll get cold yourself." "I've been colder," he said simply, his eyes steady on hers. He threw a few more logs onto the fire from the small pile he'd carried in with him. The flames sprang back to life, crackling and throwing light across the cabin walls. Slowly the room began to warm, and the tightness in Clara's chest eased just a little. The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft sigh before drifting into a deeper sleep. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the fire, the storm outside, and the quiet rhythm of the baby's breathing. Elias sat back on his heels, studying her. "You out here alone?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Had to leave. Couldn't stay where I was anymore." He didn't press. He'd seen that look before, seen it in the eyes of people who had been through things they couldn't speak of yet. Instead, he poured her a bit of water from his canteen and handed it over. "Thank you," she whispered, taking it with shaking hands. "You've got a name?" he asked gently. "Clara," she said after a pause. "Clara Mayfield." "Pretty name," he replied. "You got somewhere you're heading?" She shook her head. "Just away. Anywhere that's safe." He nodded slowly. "Well, you'll stay warm here tonight." "I'll see to that." Something in his tone, quiet, sure, protective, made Clara's heart ache. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her that way. As the hours passed, Elias tended the fire while Clara drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Every now and then he glanced over to make sure the baby was still breathing, still warm under his coat. He couldn't quite explain why he felt such a fierce need to protect them. Maybe it was because he'd lost someone once, someone who never made it through a winter storm. Maybe it was because he saw something in Clara's eyes that reminded him of himself. When dawn finally broke, the storm had quieted. The first light of morning spilled through the cracks in the cabin walls, painting everything gold. Clara awoke to find Elias sitting by the window, his hat tipped low, the fire still burning. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. He shrugged. "Didn't need to." Clara looked down at the baby. His cheeks were rosy again, his breathing steady. Relief washed over her like sunlight. "You saved us," she whispered. Elias turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "Just did what anyone should have done." But Clara knew better. Not everyone would have stopped in the middle of a blizzard for a stranger and her child. Not everyone would have given up their coat, their warmth, their comfort. As she looked at him, the quiet strength in his eyes, the gentleness in his rough hands, something deep inside her began to thaw. And in that moment, for the first time in months, Clara believed that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be all right. The baby stirred and smiled in his sleep. The fire crackled brighter, and somewhere outside, the first bird of morning called through the cold air, as if the world itself had decided to start anew. Little did Clara know this was only the beginning. The man who had found her that night, the cowboy, with the steady hands and kind eyes, was about to change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Because sometimes fate doesn't knock gently. Sometimes it rides through the snow with a lantern and a heart full of quiet mercy. And that night, when her baby was cold in the dark, a cowboy wrapped them both in his coat and his arms, and with that simple act, began to heal 3 hearts at once. The morning after the storm was as quiet as a prayer. Snow blanketed the land in endless white, and sunlight sparkled across the fields like scattered diamonds. The world seemed reborn, silent and pure, as if the violence of the night before had never happened. Inside the little cabin, the fire still burned steady, and the faint smell of smoke and pine filled the air. Clara woke slowly, her body sore from the cold and the fear that had gripped her through the night. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that her baby was warm against her chest, his tiny hand gripping the edge of the blanket. Then she saw Elias by the window, his silhouette outlined against the bright snow outside. He was sharpening a knife, quiet and calm, as though danger had never touched them. "Morning," he said softly without turning. Clara blinked, sitting up carefully. "Morning," she murmured. "Is the storm gone?" He nodded. "For now. Roads will still be buried for miles, but the worst has passed." Clara watched him for a moment. The early light caught the edges of his face, roughened by the cold but steady, grounded. There was something about him, something that felt safe, like the earth itself. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke again. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved our lives." Elias set the knife down, turning to face her. "No thanks needed. Just glad I was close enough to hear him cry." He glanced at the baby, sleeping peacefully. "He's a strong little one." Clara smiled faintly, brushing her fingers through her baby's soft hair. "His name's Samuel." Elias nodded, his expression softening. Samuel, strong name for a strong boy. They fell into a quiet rhythm after that. Elias stepped outside to gather more wood and check on his horse, while Clara tended to the fire and warmed some of the dried beans and bread he'd brought from his saddlebag. The cabin smelled of warmth, and smoke again, life returning, to a place that had nearly been claimed by death the night before. But beneath the peace, something else lingered in Clara's heart, an unease she couldn't quite name. When Elias came back inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, she found herself watching him differently. There was strength in the way he moved, yes, but also restraint, kindness. He didn't pry into her story. He didn't ask what she was running from. And that silence, that respect, made her both grateful and afraid, because it meant she might start to trust him. And trust was something she had buried deep long ago. Elias noticed her quietness as he set another log on the fire. "You got someone looking for you?" he asked gently, not to pry, but because the question was too heavy to stay unspoken. Clara hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "There was someone. My husband, he wasn't kind." She stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. When he drank, he changed. "The last time I thought he might—" Her voice broke. "I had to run. For Samuel." Elias's jaw tightened. He said nothing at first, only sat down across from her, his eyes fixed on the fire. Then he said quietly, "You did the right thing." She looked up at him, surprised. "I've seen men like that," he went on. "Men who think strength means breaking something smaller than them. My pa used to say, a man's worth isn't in how loud he talks, it's in what he protects." His words hung in the air, steady and true, like the crackle of the fire. Clara felt her throat tighten. For months she had carried her fear like a secret wound, hiding it from the world. And now, in this quiet cabin, with a man she'd only met hours ago, she finally felt seen. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. The road ahead's still long. But you and that boy, you're safe here for as long as you need." It was the first promise anyone had made her in a long time that she actually believed. The day passed slowly, the world outside glittering with snow and silence. Clara cleaned up the small space, wrapping Samuel tightly while Elias repaired a broken shutter. They talked little, but when they did, their words carried a quiet warmth. She learned he'd been a rancher all his life, that his land stretched miles out toward the foothills, and that he'd lost his brother to the winter 5 years back. "That's why I never ride without an extra coat," he said, half smiling. "Guess it finally came in handy." Clara smiled too, though her eyes shimmered with something unspoken. The way he spoke, gentle but grounded, made her feel like she was hearing the sound of safety for the first time. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the cabin, the wind began to rise again. Not a full storm this time, just a whisper of warning, as if the land itself wanted to remind them how fragile warmth could be. Elias brought in extra wood and secured the door. "You'll stay another night," he said. "Road's not ready for travel." Clara nodded. "If you're sure I'm not in the way." He met her gaze. "You're not." Later, as darkness fell, Clara sat by the fire with Samuel asleep in her arms. Elias sat across from her, quietly cleaning his rifle. The flames painted his face in gold and shadow. "Elias," she said softly after a while, "why did you stop last night? You could have ridden on." He paused, looking up. "Because I heard a cry," he said simply, "and because I've lost before." Clara's brow furrowed gently. "Lost?" He nodded. "My brother Luke got caught in a blizzard one winter. I found him too late. Been carrying that night with me ever since." The silence that followed was heavy but tender, like a shared wound between strangers who somehow understood each other's pain. Clara's eyes filled with quiet empathy. "I'm sorry." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Ain't your fault. But maybe last night was a way to set something right. Maybe hearing your baby cry was God's way of saying, I still had a chance to save someone." Clara looked down at Samuel and felt tears slip silently down her cheeks. "You did," she whispered. Hours passed like that, two souls bound by fate and firelight. And as the wind sighed outside, something fragile but real began to bloom between them, a kind of peace neither had felt in years. When it was time to rest, Elias laid his coat over them again before settling by the door, rifle within reach. "You'll be safe," he murmured, half to her, half to himself. "I'll see to that." Clara watched him for a moment, her heart full of gratitude she couldn't put into words. Then she whispered, "Good night, Elias." He tipped his hat slightly. "Good night, ma'am." Morning came soft and golden. The storm had finally broken for good. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney as the cabin filled with the Smell of fresh coffee. Clara stood by the window, Samuel resting against her shoulder, and looked out over the snow-covered fields. For the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Elias stepped up beside her, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. Snow's melting fast. By noon I can take you into town. There's a family there, the Turners. Good people. They'll help you get settled. Clara nodded slowly, though her heart ached at the thought of leaving. You've done enough already, she said softly. I don't want to burden you more. He shook his head. Ain't a burden to help someone find their way again. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the world thaw. When it was time to go, Elias saddled his horse and helped Clara up carefully. Samuel tucked warm in his arms. The ride was long, quiet, filled with the sound of hooves crunching through the snow. The sky was a brilliant blue, and every breath of air felt like a promise. As they reached the ridge overlooking the small town, Clara looked back toward the horizon. The cabin stood far behind them now, just a speck among the trees, but in her heart, it would always be the place where she was found, where warmth returned, where a cowboy had wrapped her and her baby in his coat and changed everything. She turned to Elias, her eyes shining. I'll never forget you. He smiled faintly, his voice low and sure. You don't have to. Just promise me you'll keep that boy warm, and you'll never look back in fear again. Clara nodded, tears glistening in her lashes. I promise. He tipped his hat, and for a moment, neither moved. The wind carried the sound of peace between them. Then he turned his horse toward the open plain, the sun at his back. Clara watched him disappear into the horizon, her heart full of something she hadn't dared feel in a long time. Faith. Faith that kindness still existed. Faith that even in the coldest night, warmth could find you. And faith that sometimes, when the world feels lost, a cowboy can ride in, not to rescue you, but to remind you how to stand again. As she cradled Samuel and walked toward the town, she whispered, We're going to be okay, my love, because good hearts still walk this earth. The snow glistened like silver, and somewhere far off, a horse's hoofbeats echoed softly against the hills. And so ended the story of a cold night, a mother's courage, and the man who taught her that the strongest kind of love isn't loud or proud. It's quiet, steady, and warm enough to melt even the fiercest winter.